I think I'm not by no means an expert. One thing I do know is that in Islam, pictorial images of the Prophet and generally the sort of iconography that we have in the Christian tradition doesn't exist.
No.
And instead, calligraphy is a very highly praised skill. And in Japan and China and Korea, calligraphy are also very highly regarded.
Yeah. When we had our meeting in Morocco a few years ago, we had some very interesting talks by local Moroccan scholars on the typesetting of Arabic, with very, very fine illustrations of this classical typography, which until the late 20th century was done entirely by hand. It was not automated.
Unbelievable.
To go back to portable tech documents and accessibility and so forth, we're in a situation now where large amounts of data are created using keyboards, not by handwriting. And the higher the quality of the output of the typing, the more we can do with that. So I remember I had a sort of secondhand cheap typewriter, and it didn't have a letter 1. You used the L instead.
Really? Okay.
Okay. And you could tell from the contents what it was, which it was. And in a certain sense, what we want is we want the people who are typing to do a good job of data capture. And the difficulty with word processing is you get a visual representation, but you don't know what it is a visual representation of. It's, what's the word? You can't tell whether two things are supposed to be together or happen to be together, because you don't know whether it was just an accident that they line up or not. And for accessibility, we want particular information that might otherwise not be available. So in a certain sense, you could think of the whole game from the accessibility point of view, is you're trying to capture information, you want the information to be high quality. Now, one measure of the quality is that LaTeX will successfully typeset it. That's one measure, but it's not the only measure, and it's not the appropriate measure for accessibility. For accessibility, you've got other things you want to think about, because LaTeX will typeset all sorts of things, which, well, the slides I gave for my talk at the conference last week, I put hard spaces in to sort of separate things out, to group things. So I have a list of things to talk, the slide is a bunch of lines. And I don't put horizontal rules in because that's distracting, but I do put extra spaces in so that it's sort of got a rhythm. Perhaps another way of looking at it is when you typeset poetry in a poetry book, it's all on lines. And if a line is long, it sort of continues with an indent in the next line. Whereas if you're doing it in a newspaper article, you use a solidus, a slash, to indicate this is the end of one line and the beginning of next. Now, can you imagine how poetry would be if you were typesetting it in a paragraph without putting the solidus in? But that's exactly the sort of information that you need for accessibility, together with text descriptions for graphical information, for example.
Interesting.
So, what's the word? An X sometimes means multiply, and it sometimes means X. And in mathematics, you've got to be clear.
Yes.
And that clarity has to come through to the person who is not sighted. or has other disabilities. And somebody I worked with at Cambridge University Press said, if you can give the authors feedback early on in the process, you'll get better outcome. And you'll get even better outcome if the users benefit from that feedback. If they're getting feedback that is actually valuable to them, then they'll look at it. And at the moment, the only feedback we get is the typeset output. We don't get any sort of accessibility feedback. And Nelson was talking about how if your text was properly structured, you can search it like a database.
Yes.
Now, if our LaTeX text is properly structured and we can search it like a database and that's useful, then that's a big incentive for the authors to provide this extra value to themselves and other people.
I want to interject here a little anecdote about Unicode. The Greek, Latin, and Cyrillic alphabets all have letters with the Latin letter glyph shapes A, B, C, and IBM. Well, I was doing some bibliographic work earlier this week, and on a page where the authors were Russian, of course, the text was, it's English language article, and the text was in English. But when I converted the HTML to BibTeX, I discovered that the first letters of their initials and their family names were not the normal Latin letters, but in fact were Cyrillic letters. The fact that IBM can be written with essentially 3 different alphabets means that a web address like ibm.com can be totally bogus if you don't know what the glyphs are. And this has caused a considerable amount of consternation in the Unicode community and the HTML community. There was a posting earlier this week of a rather perverse example of someone who interspersed Unicode characters that caused the display direction to change from left to right to left. And been doing this in a clever way, they were able to embed in comments these writing direction changes, but in such a way that when the text was displayed in an editor, there was material that was overwritten. In other words, there was code in the computer program that you could not see on the screen, and it could be doing malicious things.
For
So
heaven's sakes.
On the C standards list, does the language have to do something about this, or do we view this as an issue that we have to handle with other tools? And I think the consensus is it's not the job of a programming language to try to deal with this. This is an obfuscation mechanism that applies to any document in any programming language.
And you could easily find it by using an ancient editor which doesn't understand Unicode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Wow, so you could use a certain key combination to generate a letters that look like IBM when really they're not. You could go to GoDaddy or some domain hosting company, enter those particular keyboard codes, and find that that URL is available and it will display the same as IBM, but you can't get to it typing IBM. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
The internet standards bodies are trying to come up with ways of dealing with this, but it's a non-trivial problem. And we know that bad guys always find ways around the defenses that the good guys put up. So we won't solve this problem in a hurry.
Well, yeah, if you want to make it appear like you're getting an email from IBM, create a domain using extended, ASCII characters?
Unicode characters, yeah.
Unicode characters. Oh my gosh. Well,
there was one bright spot in all this chaos, which is that there's a proposal to add Klingon to Unicode, to the Unicode, the Klingon alphabet to Unicode. Yes. And the bright spot is that it was refused.
Yeah, and this has come up many times, and it's been discussed several times in the past month because I'm on the Unicode list.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
There's a handful of people who can actually speak Klingon. It's a synthetic language designed by a linguist that follows standard rules for creation of languages. It has odd pronunciation and strange letter shapes. And so this community would like to see it standardized, but the consortium for Unicode remains opposed because their goal was to essentially to come up with an encoding system for writing all of the historical scripts that humans have used on planet Earth. And Klingon, of course, is not planet Earth.
Well, that's true. Isn't that funny? Well, gentlemen, thank you. This has been an enlightening get-together.